When you hear the words medieval castle, you probably imagine something magnificent. Towering stone walls rising from a misty hillside, banners snapping in the wind above crenellated battlements, a drawbridge lowering slowly over a shimmering moat, while knights in polished plate armor ride through the gates on caparisoned warhorses. Inside, you picture grand halls with roaring fireplaces, feasts laid out on gleaming oak tables heavy with roasted meats and golden goblets of wine. Perhaps a princess gazing wistfully from a high tower window, her hair catching the sunlight. Hollywood and fairy tales have spent more than a century building this image, layering it with romance and grandeur until it feels like memory rather than fiction. But it is almost entirely wrong. The reality of a medieval castle was smoke. It was bone-deep cold that crept through stone walls no matter how large the fire. It was the smell of animal dung mixing with wood ash, tallow candles, and the faint, sweet rot of rushes on the floor that had not been changed in weeks. A castle was not a palace. It was not designed for beauty or comfort. It was a military installation that people happened to live in, and living in it meant enduring conditions that most of us today would find unbearable within a matter of hours. The walls that look so romantic in photographs were not built to be admired. They were built to keep people alive during sieges that could grind on for weeks or months. Every stone, every arrow slit, every spiral staircase that turned clockwise, deliberately, so that a right-handed defender could swing his sword freely while an attacker climbing upward could not, was designed with one single purpose: survival. So what was it really like to wake up inside one of these places? To eat there? To work there? To grow old and very possibly die there? The answer might change the way you look at castles forever. To understand what daily life felt like inside a castle, we need to place ourselves in a specific moment in time. Let us say it is the year 1280, give or take a decade. We are somewhere in England, perhaps in the Welsh Marches, where the border between English and Welsh territory was a constant source of tension, raiding, and open warfare. The king on the throne is Edward I, a tall, hard-faced and fearsome warrior king who was spending enormous sums building some of the most impressive castles ever constructed. Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, to crush Welsh resistance once and for all. But the castle we are standing in is not one of his grand royal projects. It is a baronial castle, the seat of a minor lord who holds his lands from a more powerful earl, who in turn holds his own estates from the king. This is how the feudal system worked. Land was not owned in the modern sense. It was held in exchange for loyalty, service, and above all, military obligation. The castle was the physical expression of that arrangement: a fortress, a court, a farm, a prison, and a home, all compressed into one compound of stone and timber. If you lived in this castle, your entire existence was shaped by obligation that stretched above and below you in an unbroken chain. The lord owed military service to his overlord, typically 40 days of armed service each year, more in times of crisis. His knights owed the same to him. The servants owed labor and obedience. The peasants in the surrounding villages owed rent in coin and in kind, bushels of grain, chickens, eggs, days of unpaid labor in the castle's fields during ploughing and harvest. Everyone owed something to someone, and the castle sat at the center of this web of obligation like a great stone spider, pulling in resources and radiating authority. The household itself was not a family in the way we understand the word. It was a small, self-contained community, perhaps 80 to 150 people at any given time. that included the lord and his wife, their children, a chaplain who served as both priest and secretary, a steward who managed the finances and the stores, a marshal who oversaw the horses and the men-at-arms, a butler who managed the wine and ale, a pantler who managed the bread, knights who owed residential service, squires training for knighthood, cooks, scullions, stable hands, laundresses, and an assortment of servants whose roles ranged from essential to deeply unpleasant. This was not a quiet household. It was a noisy, crowded, hierarchical world where privacy was almost unknown and personal space was a luxury that belonged only to the lord himself, and even he shared his chamber with attendants. Beyond the castle walls, the village and its fields stretched out in narrow strips, each peasant family working their allocated land alongside the lord's domain, the portion of the estate that the lord farmed directly for his own profit. The peasants who worked these fields looked up at the castle every day of their lives, and what they saw was not beauty. It was power, a constant, immovable reminder of who controlled their labor, their harvests, their justice, and their fate. The wider world in 1280 was a place of deep uncertainty and slow, grinding change. The Crusades were winding down in failure, and the last Christian strongholds in the Holy Land would fall within the decade. The Mongol Empire had already swept across Asia and deep into Eastern Europe, and rumors of their vast armies and terrible horsemen still caused unease in courts across Christendom. Trade was expanding. English wool was making some merchants astonishingly wealthy, and Italian banking families were extending credit across borders. But famine and disease were never more than one bad harvest away. The average life expectancy was somewhere around 30 to 35 years, though this number is deeply misleading. It was dragged down by catastrophic infant mortality. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. If you survived childhood, you might well live into your 50s or even your 60s. But you would do so in a world without antibiotics, without anesthesia, without any real understanding of how disease actually spread. This was the world the castle existed in, and every aspect of its design, from the thickness of its walls to the depth of its well, reflected that reality. Now imagine you are approaching this castle for the first time. You have been walking for several hours along a muddy track that winds through dense forest and then opens out into cultivated fields. The castle appears gradually. First, the top of the keep rising above a line of trees, a dark square shape against the grey sky. Then the curtain walls come into view, stretching out on either side. Then the gatehouse, flanked by twin drum towers, its entrance dark as a mouth. The first thing that strikes you is not beauty. It is mass. The sheer physical mass of the thing. The walls are enormous, perhaps 30 feet high and 8 to 10 feet thick at the base, built from rough-cut limestone blocks that have weathered to a greyish yellow streaked with lichen. They are not smooth or elegant. They are blunt, functional, brutal, thick enough to withstand the impact of a battering ram swung by a dozen men, high enough to make scaling with ladders a proposition so dangerous it amounted to suicide. As you draw closer, the smell reaches you before anything else. The moat, if the castle has one, and many did, it's not the crystal clear water of paintings. It is essentially an open sewer. Waste from the castle latrines, called garderobes, drain directly into it through stone chutes built into the outer walls. Kitchen waste, animal carcasses, and general refuse added to the mix. The water is greenish-brown, thick with algae in summer, and the stench on a warm day is powerful enough to make your eyes water from 20 paces. Flies cluster in dense, humming clouds above the surface. This was not an oversight in the castle's design. A foul moat was actually considered a defensive advantage. No attacking soldier wanted to wade chest-deep through that particular combination of human waste and stagnant water while crossbow bolts rained down from above. You cross the drawbridge, which groans under your weight. Heavy oak planks worn smooth by years of traffic, suspended over the moat by thick iron chains that run up into the gatehouse mechanism. The entrance passage is deliberately narrow, perhaps wide enough for a single cart, and it is dark. The temperature drops sharply as you step out of the daylight and into the shadow of the walls. Above you, barely visible in the gloom, are murder holes, small openings in the vaulted ceiling through which the defenders could pour boiling water, heated sand, quicklime, or simply drop heavy stones onto anyone who tried to force their way through. The passage runs for perhaps 15 feet, and at each end hangs an iron portcullis, a massive grilled gate of oak reinforced with iron that could be dropped in seconds, trapping an attacker in a killing zone from which there was no escape. You feel the chill of the stone pressing in on both sides. Your footsteps echo, and then the passage opens, and you step out into the light of the bailey. The outer bailey is a broad, open courtyard that functions as the working heart of the castle. This is where the real business of daily life happens, and the first impression is of noise, movement, and smell. The stables line one wall. You hear horses stamping, snorting, the clank of harness, the voice of a groom cursing at a stubborn palfrey. The smithy occupies a corner near the gate, and the rhythmic ring of hammer on iron carries across the entire yard, punctuated by the hiss of hot metal being plunged into the quenching trough. Nearby stands the bakehouse, a squat stone building with its own oven. Fire risk demanded that baking be done in a separate structure, and the warm, yeasty smell of bread competes with the sharper stink of the brewhouse next door, where ale is in a constant state of production. Chickens scratch in the dirt between the buildings. Dogs, lean, half-wild castle dogs that serve as ratters and scrap disposal units, trot between groups of servants. The ground is a churned mixture of packed earth, straw, and mud, slippery in wet weather and baked into ruts when dry. The Great Hall is the largest and most important building in the castle. It is where the household eats, where the lord holds court, where business is conducted and disputes are settled, and where most of the castle's inhabitants sleep at night. Walking inside, you notice the floor first. In wealthier castles, it might be tiled, decorated clay tiles in geometric patterns, but more commonly, it is covered with rushes, dry grasses, and reeds spread thickly across the stone and mixed with herbs like lavender, tansy, or meadowsweet to combat the smell. The problem is that these rushes were not changed nearly often enough. Fresh layers were simply thrown on top of old ones, and over weeks and months, the lower layers became a compressed mat of decomposing organic matter. The 16th century scholar Erasmus, writing about English domestic habits that had changed little in centuries, described typical floor rushes as harboring spittle, vomit, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. While Erasmus was describing a slightly later period, the practice in castles of the 13th century was, if anything, less hygienic, not more. The hall itself is impressive in its way. The ceiling soars above you, supported by massive timber beams, entire oak trunks, squared and fitted together with wooden pegs. A large fireplace is set into one wall, or in older halls, a central hearth sits directly on the floor. The smoke rising theoretically, toward a louver in the roof, a kind of ventilation turret with angled slats designed to let smoke out while keeping rain from pouring in. In practice, these louvers worked poorly. Smoke from the central hearth filled the upper portion of the hall in a permanent blue-grey haze that darkened the already dim space and stung your eyes until they watered. Your clothes absorbed the smell of wood smoke within minutes and never fully lost it again. The windows are narrow slits in the outer walls, slightly wider lancet openings higher up, and they let in very little light. Glass existed but was rare and expensive, reserved for churches and the wealthiest households. Most castle windows were covered with oiled linen stretched over wooden frames, which admitted a feeble, diffuse glow, or they were simply left open to the elements, plugged with wooden shutters when the weather turned vicious. In winter, even with the fire roaring, the great hall was bitterly cold. You could feel the chill radiating from the stone walls like a living thing, pressing against your back while the fire scorched your face. Medieval people understood this problem. They hung heavy woolen tapestries on the walls, not primarily for decoration, but for insulation, trapping a thin layer of warmer air between the fabric and the freezing stone. At one end of the hall, raised on a wooden platform called a dais about a foot above the main floor, sits the high table. This is where the lord and his family take their meals, positioned so that they can see the entire hall and every person in it, and so that every person in the hall can see them. Eating at the high table was a performance of power. Behind the dais, a doorway leads through a thick stone wall to the sola, the lord's private chamber, the only room in the entire castle that offers anything approaching privacy. Even here, the lord and his wife share the space with one or two personal attendants who sleep on pallets at the foot of the bed or just outside the door. The sola contains the castle's most valuable piece of furniture, a proper bed, a heavy wooden frame fitted with a lattice of rope supporting a mattress stuffed with straw, wool or, for the wealthiest lords, goose feathers. Linen sheets, heavy woolen blankets, and fur coverlets of vair or miniver made the lord's bed the warmest and most comfortable place in the entire castle. It belonged to exactly 2 people. Everyone else managed with far less. Knights, squires, and senior servants slept in the great hall itself. After the evening meal, the trestle tables were dismantled or pushed against the walls, and the household rolled out their bedding on the rush-covered floor. Straw-stuffed pallets, cloaks, whatever they had. You slept in your clothes. You slept surrounded by dozens of other people. Their breathing, their snoring, their coughing, the occasional sound of someone stumbling to the door to relieve themselves in the night. The fire died down to embers as the hours passed, and by the early morning the cold was severe enough to wake you. Dogs curled up among the sleepers for warmth, and rats could be heard scratching in the rushes at the edges of the room. Privacy, in any sense a modern person would recognize, simply did not exist. The chapel deserves mention as the other significant interior space, and it was often the most carefully constructed room in the castle, vaulted in stone where the rest of the castle used timber, sometimes decorated with painted walls depicting scenes from the Bible, occasionally graced with simple stained glass that cast colored light across the altar on bright mornings. The chaplain held services daily, and attendance was not optional. Religion in the 13th century was not a private matter of personal belief. It was the framework of existence, woven into every meal that began with grace, every journey that began with a prayer, every legal oath sworn on a relic, every sunrise that was understood as an act of divine will, Your day in the castle begins well before dawn. There is no alarm clock, no gentle chime, but the castle has its own rhythms that pull you from sleep with the reliability of a machine. The roosters in the bailey begin crowing while the sky is still fully dark, their harsh calls carrying easily through the thin walls and open windows. Shortly after, the chapel bell rings, a single clear note that echoes off the stone, summoning the household to the first prayers of the day. If you are a servant, you are already on your feet and moving, raking out the grey ashes from the great hearth, coaxing the embers back to life with handfuls of dry kindling and long, steady breaths, hauling water in wooden buckets from the well in the bailey, feeding the chickens and the pigs, mucking out the stables while the horses stamp and blow clouds of steam into the freezing air. If you are a squire, a young man of good birth, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, training for knighthood, you rise from your pallet, splash icy water on your face from a stone basin, pull on your hose and boots with stiff fingers, and report to your knight for the morning's duties. The stone floor beneath your bare feet when you first stand is so cold it feels almost wet. The air is raw and damp. There is no hot water, no warm towel, no cup of coffee. You begin the day cold and hungry, and you will not be fully warm until you stand near the fire after breakfast. That first meal is a modest affair, nothing like the feasts of legend. For most of the household, breakfast consists of bread, coarse, dark bread made from rye or a mixture of rye and wheat, washed down with ale from the brewhouse, perhaps a piece of hard cheese, perhaps some cold meat left over from the previous night's supper, if there is any. You eat quickly, standing near the fire or sitting on a bench at one of the long tables, and then your duties begin in earnest. If you are a squire, your morning involves cleaning and oiling your knight's mail armor, a tedious task that involves tumbling the mail in a barrel of sand and vinegar to remove rust, grooming the horses, and then practicing with weapons in the bailey yard. Sword drills, lance work at the quinton, a pivoting wooden target that swings around and strikes you in the back if you are too slow, and wrestling. These are not games. They are preparation for real combat, and the bruises, sprains, and occasional broken bones they produce are accepted without complaint. By mid-morning, the castle is fully awake and operating at full capacity. The steward, the Lord's chief administrator, the man who makes the household actually function, is in the counting house reviewing accounts, checking the stores of grain and salted meat, calculating how long the current supplies will last, settling disputes among the kitchen staff, or arbitrating a quarrel between two servants over sleeping space. The marshal oversees the stables, inspects the horses, and drills the men-at-arms, professional soldiers who form the castle's permanent garrison and who are, in many ways, the most important people within its walls. The Lord himself may spend the morning holding court in the great hall, seated in a heavy wooden chair on the dais, hearing complaints from his tenants, adjudicating disputes over field boundaries or accusations of theft, receiving petitions, or meeting with messengers. Justice in a medieval lordship was personal, immediate, and often arbitrary by modern standards. The Lord had the legal right to judge most cases involving his tenants, and punishments could range from monetary fines to public flogging to confinement in the castle's own prison. The main meal of the day, called dinner, is served around 10 or 11 in the morning, much earlier than modern dining habits would suggest. The entire household gathers in the great hall. The Lord and his family sit at the high table on the dais. Everyone else sits at long trestle tables arranged down the length of the hall, in strict order of rank. This seating was not casual. Where you sat mattered enormously. Being placed closer to the Lord's table was a visible sign of favor and status. Being pushed to the far end of the hall, near the drafty doors and the servants' entrance, was an unmistakable insult that everyone noticed and remembered. The afternoon stretches out, filled with work, training, or leisure, depending entirely on your station. Knights and squires continue their martial exercises in the bailey. The lord might ride out to inspect his lands, visit a tenant, or go hunting. And hunting was not merely sport. It was both a social ritual that reinforced bonds between the lord and his retainers and a practical source of fresh meat. Hunting with hawks and hounds across the lord's deer parks and rabbit warrens was the great aristocratic passion of the age, and proficiency in the hunt was considered an essential mark of noble breeding. The women of the household, the lady of the castle, her daughters, her attendants and waiting women, spent much of the afternoon in the solar or in a separate chamber, engaged in embroidery and needlework, managing household accounts with the steward, overseeing the education of younger children, or supervising the preparation of medicines and herbal remedies from the castle's garden. The lady's role was far more than decorative. She was effectively the castle's chief operating officer, responsible for provisioning, staffing, and running the household on a daily basis. In the lord's absence, which could last weeks or months during military campaigns, pilgrimages, or attendance at court, she held full authority over the entire estate, including military command of the garrison. This was not theoretical. Nicolas de la Haye defended Lincoln Castle during the Civil War of 1217, holding the fortress against rebel barons and an invading French army with fierce determination, earning the personal gratitude of the young King Henry III. She was not unique. Dozens of noblewomen across medieval Europe found themselves commanding garrisons, negotiating with enemies, and making life or death military decisions. A second, lighter meal called supper is served in the late afternoon or early evening. Bread, cheese, perhaps a bowl of pottage or some cold meat. After supper, as the light fades and candles and rushlights are lit throughout the hall, the castle's social life comes alive. A traveling musician might play the harp or the vielle, a bowed string instrument. A storyteller might recount tales of Charlemagne, King Arthur, or the heroes of the Crusades. Board games were popular among all ranks. Chess was considered a noble accomplishment, but backgammon and a strategy game called Nine Men's Morris were played by everyone. Dice games, though officially condemned by the church as encouraging vice, were played constantly and with passionate intensity, leading to frequent arguments and occasional violence. Drinking continued until the fire burned low and the candles guttered. Then the tables were cleared, the sleeping pallets rolled out across the rushes, and the castle settled into darkness. A night watchman paced the walls above, calling the hours. The gatehouse was sealed, and the cycle began again. Now, let us talk about what you actually put in your mouth, because this is where the distance between our world and the medieval world becomes most visceral and most startling. The food in a castle was substantially better than what the peasants in the surrounding villages ate. But it would still give a modern person serious pause. The absolute staple was bread. Bread appeared at every single meal, and for the lower-ranking members of the household, bread essentially was the meal. But not all bread was equal. The Lord's table received fine white bread, called westel, made from carefully sifted wheat flour, light and relatively soft. The household knights and senior servants ate a coarser wheat bread. The lower servants and men-at-arms ate bread made from rye, or a mixture of rye and barley, dark, dense, and heavy, with a sour tang and a texture that required serious jaw work. All of this bread regardless of quality, contained minute particles of stone grit from the millstones that ground the flour. This grit was invisible to the eye but devastating to the teeth over a lifetime. Archaeologists examining medieval skulls consistently find extreme tooth wear, dental abscesses, and premature tooth loss, even in individuals who died relatively young. By middle age, chronic dental pain was simply a fact of life for nearly everyone. Meat was more abundant in a castle than in a peasant household, but it came with its own considerable challenges. Fresh meat was essentially seasonal. The Great Autumn Slaughter, when animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed, produced an enormous quantity of flesh that then had to be preserved. Salting was the most common method, packing layers of raw meat between thick layers of coarse salt in wooden barrels. Smoking and pickling in brine were also used. By late winter and into spring, this preserved meat had developed a powerful flavor, pungent, sharp, sometimes verging on rancid, that required aggressive seasoning to make palatable. The heavy use of spices in medieval cooking, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, mace, saffron, was not primarily about displaying wealth, though it certainly did that. It was about making meat that was weeks or months old, something you could actually swallow without gagging. Fresh game from hunting supplemented the diet and was eagerly anticipated, but it went primarily to the Lord's table. Fish played an enormous role in the medieval diet because the church mandated an extraordinary number of fasting days. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were fast days in many dioceses. The entire season of Lent, 40 days before Easter, was a fast. Advent was a fast. The vigils before major saints' days were fasts. Added together, fasting days consumed nearly half the calendar year, and on these days, meat was strictly forbidden. The household ate fish instead. Freshwater fish from the castle's own stew ponds, where carp, pike, bream, and tench were raised specifically for this purpose, supplemented by vast quantities of salted herring and dried cod imported from the North Sea and the Atlantic coast. Vegetables existed but occupied a distinctly secondary position on the medieval table. Peas, beans, onions, leeks, garlic, cabbages and turnips formed the base of pottage, a thick, filling stew that simmered over the kitchen fire for hours at a time and was the everyday sustenance of servants and lower-ranking household members. Fruit was seasonal and often cooked. Apples and pears baked in pastry, cherries and plums stewed with honey and spices. Sugar was a rare and expensive import from the East, treated almost as a medicine. Honey was the common sweetener, harvested from hives kept in the castle gardens or purchased from local beekeepers, and the drink. Water was understood, even without germ theory, purely from observation and bitter experience, to be unreliable and often dangerous. Medieval people could not explain why water sometimes made you violently ill, but they knew that it did, and they acted accordingly. The universal daily drink was ale, brewed continuously in the castle brewhouse from malted barley, sometimes flavored with herbs or spices, but in England before the late 14th century, typically unhopped. It was thick, cloudy, slightly sweet, low in alcohol compared to modern beer, and consumed in quantities that seem staggering by today's standards. A single adult might drink a gallon or more per day. Wine was the prestige drink, imported in barrel loads from Gascony, the English-controlled wine region in southwestern France, and reserved primarily for the Lord's table and honored guests. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was less common by the 13th century, but still appeared on festive occasions. One detail that surprises modern visitors to reconstructed medieval kitchens is the sheer scale of food preparation required to feed a castle household. A single day's baking for a garrison of 100 people might consume several bushels of grain. The kitchen was a separate building, deliberately isolated from the main hall because of the constant fire risk, and it operated from dawn to well past dark, a hot, smoky, chaotic space where cooks worked over open fires so large that entire carcasses could be roasted on iron spits, turned by hand. The heat was intense in summer, and burns were an occupational hazard that every cook carried on their arms and hands. The Great Hall at mealtimes was a carefully choreographed display of social order. Food was served in courses, brought from the kitchen across the bailey by a procession of servants. The lord and his guests ate from shared dishes called messes, typically one mess for every 2 diners, and the quality of your mess depended entirely on your rank. The lord's mess might include roast venison, a sauce of wine and spices, and a delicate almond milk pudding. A servant's mess at the far end of the hall contained salt beef, dark bread, and pottage. Plates, as we know them, did not exist for most diners. Instead, thick slices of stale bread, called trenchers, served as edible plates, soaking up the juices and sauces from the food placed on them. At the end of the meal, the used trenchers, now soggy with grease and gravy, were collected in baskets and distributed to the poor at the castle gate, a small act of charity that also served as a practical form of waste disposal. Hygiene is the subject where modern sensibilities collide most violently with medieval reality. The people living in a castle were not quite as filthy as the worst stereotypes suggest. They did wash their hands before meals, as a matter of both custom and practicality, and bathing was not unknown. But their standards were radically, almost incomprehensibly different from ours. A full bath was an event, not a daily routine. It required servants to heat enormous quantities of water over the kitchen fire, carry it bucket by bucket up narrow stone stairs, and fill a large wooden tub in the solar or a bathing chamber. This might happen once a week for the lord and his lady, considerably less often for everyone else, and almost never during the depths of winter when the sheer effort of heating enough water combined with the brutal cold of an unheated room made the whole enterprise pointless and potentially dangerous. Between baths, people wiped their hands and faces with damp linen cloths. Hair was washed infrequently, and usually with a mixture of wood ash and water that served as a crude soap. Lice were universal. Fleas were a constant, crawling, biting presence that infested bedding, clothing, and rushes alike. You did not fight them. You could not fight them. You lived with them. The wealthiest baron in England scratched just as often and just as vigorously as his poorest kitchen boy. The garderobe, the castle toilet, deserves a moment of attention because it tells you something essential about the gap between medieval life and modern comfort. It was a small chamber built into the thickness of the outer wall, usually projecting slightly outward on corbels, so that the waste dropped down the exterior face of the castle into the moat, or a cesspit at the base of the wall. The seat was a flat stone slab with a round hole cut in it, worn smooth by generations of use. There was no door, just a curtain, or more commonly, a right-angled entry passage that provided a minimal visual screen. The draft that rose constantly through the opening from below was fierce, especially in winter, and carried with it a smell that no amount of herb strewing could disguise. The word garderobe itself is revealing. It literally means guard robe, because people hung their cloaks and garments in or near the latrine chamber, believing that the ammonia fumes rising from the waste below would kill the moths and fleas that infested fabric. This was actually somewhat effective, but it tells you everything you need to know about the ambient smell of a medieval castle when the toilet was considered an appropriate place to store your clothing. The social world inside these walls was governed by hierarchy so rigid, so pervasive, that it shaped every interaction, every meal, every sleeping arrangement, and every conversation. The Lord stood at the apex. Below him came his wife and children, then his household knights, then the senior officers, steward, marshal, chaplain, butler, and then the vast majority of the household, the cooks, the grooms, the laundresses, the scullions, the dairymaids, the gardeners, the men-at-arms. Where you fell in this hierarchy determined not just your duties, but your diet, your sleeping position, the quality of your clothing, and the degree of respect you could expect from those around you. This was not casual social stratification. It was the organizing principle of existence, reinforced daily at the dining table, where the lord ate white bread and drank wine on the dais, while the scullion at the far end of the hall ate dark bread and drank ale, and counted himself fortunate to have either. Visitors arrived regularly and brought both excitement and financial strain. A lord was bound by the code of hospitality to receive and entertain travelers of appropriate rank, fellow nobles, abbots, royal messengers, itinerant judges. These visits could last for days and required the household to stage elaborate displays of generosity that sometimes strained the stores to their limits. A great lord might arrive with an entourage of 20 or 30 people and as many horses, all of whom expected to be fed and housed. Entertainment during these visits could include hunting parties in the castle's deer park, hawking along nearby rivers, music and storytelling in the hall, and if the host was wealthy and ambitious enough, tournaments, organized martial competitions where knights jousted and fought in melees for prizes, glory, and the chance to ransom defeated opponents for considerable sums of money. The festivals of the church calendar punctuated the grinding routine of castle life and offered rare moments of genuine joy. Christmas was the great feast of the year. 12 full days of celebration beginning on December 25th, during which normal work ceased. The hall was decorated with holly, ivy, and evergreen branches. An enormous Yule log burned in the great hearth, and the household ate and drank with an abandon that was officially encouraged. Mummers performed, carols were sung, gifts were exchanged, and even the lowest servants enjoyed better food and more ale than usual. Easter, Midsummer, Michaelmas at the end of September, and the feasts of important local saints were all observed with special meals, games, and reduced labor. These were the bright points in the calendar, the days that people anticipated for weeks and remembered for months. But the castle, for all its pageantry and social ritual, was also a place of real and constant danger. Disease was the most pervasive threat, and the one against which the castle's formidable defenses were utterly useless. Without any understanding of bacteria, viruses, or contagion in the modern sense, medieval people attributed illness to bad air, the theory of miasma, to imbalances in the body's four humors, or to divine punishment for sin. Medical treatment was accordingly ineffective and often actively harmful. A fever might be treated with bloodletting, opening a vein in the arm and draining blood into a basin, in the belief that this would restore the balance of the humors. Infected wounds were cauterized with hot iron or packed with poultices of animal dung and honey. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and food prepared in unsanitary conditions, swept through castle households with grim regularity, sometimes incapacitating a significant portion of the garrison. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women of every social class. The lady of the castle, surrounded by whatever comforts wealth could provide, still faced roughly a 1 in 10 chance of dying every time she gave birth, and she was expected to bear children frequently. 6, 8, 10 pregnancies over a lifetime was not unusual. Many did not survive them all. The castle dungeon was not a myth, though it was not always the elaborate underground torture chamber of popular imagination. Many castles had dedicated holding cells, cramped, dark, damp rooms at the base of a tower or beneath the keep, accessible only through a trapdoor or a narrow door that was barred from the outside. Prisoners might be held for ransom if they were noble. A captured knight was a valuable asset, or for political leverage, or simply as punishment. Conditions were appalling by any standard. Darkness, damp, cold stone that never dried. Minimal food, bread and water if the prisoner was fortunate. Nothing at all if the captor was vindictive. No sanitation beyond a bucket. Some prisoners spent months or years in these conditions. The oubliette, from the French oublier to forget, was a cell accessible only through a hole in the ceiling into which prisoners were lowered and, as the name suggests, forgotten. Whether oubliettes were widespread or exceptional is still debated by historians, but their existence in at least some castles is documented. Fire was a terror that haunted every castle household. The buildings contained enormous quantities of combustible material. The timber roof structures, the wooden floors of upper stories, the furniture, the stored grain and hay, the rushes on the floor, the tapestries on the walls. Cooking was done over open flames in the kitchen. Candles and rushlights, lengths of dried rush dipped in tallow, provided illumination throughout the castle, and each one was a potential ignition source. A knocked-over candle, a spark from the hearth, a kitchen fire that spread. Any of these could send flames racing through the wooden elements within the stone shell with terrifying speed. Firefighting amounted to a bucket chain from the well and frantic prayer. Major fires damaged or destroyed parts of many castles, sometimes trapping and killing inhabitants in upper floors before they could escape down the narrow spiral stairs. And then there was the ever-present possibility of siege. A castle existed because violence existed, and many castles endured at least one siege during their active lifetime. A siege meant weeks or months of confinement within the walls, while an enemy army surrounded the castle, cut off supply lines, and attempted to starve the garrison into submission. As supplies dwindled, the garrison ate the horses, then the dogs, then the rats. Water sources could be poisoned or diverted. Disease spread with terrifying speed in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The psychological toll, the combination of grinding boredom, constant fear, gnawing hunger, and the knowledge that an assault could come at any hour of the day or night, was immense. Siege warfare was not glorious. It was a war of patience and attrition, of slow starvation and creeping despair, punctuated by brief episodes of extreme and chaotic violence, when the attackers launched an assault on the walls, or the defenders sallied out in a desperate attempt to break the siege lines. When you walk through the ruins of a medieval castle today, and there are hundreds of them across Britain and Europe, their broken walls standing open to the sky, their great halls reduced to grassy outlines in the earth, their towers crumbling and softened by centuries of rain and wind, it is easy to feel romance. Tourists photograph the ruins against spectacular sunsets. Children play on the walls, pretending to be knights and princesses. The gift shop sells wooden swords and souvenir shields, but the people who actually lived within these walls did not see romance. They saw necessity. A castle was not a fairy tale backdrop. It was not a home in any sense we would recognize. It was a machine, a machine for controlling territory, extracting resources, projecting military power, and surviving in a world where the next threat might come not in years or months, but in days. The lord who sat at the high table on the dais, eating his fine white bread and sipping his imported Gascon wine from a silver cup, was not a man of leisure living in luxury. He was managing a complex, dangerous enterprise, military, economic, legal and social, that demanded constant vigilance and carried constant risk. The servants who slept on the rush-covered floor of the great hall, huddled in their cloaks against the cold, were not quaint background characters in someone else's story. They were working people whose labor, skill and endurance kept the entire operation functioning, whose lives were shaped entirely by the needs of the institution they served, and whose names were rarely recorded by anyone. The knights who trained each morning in the bailey, hacking at wooden posts with heavy swords until their arms burned, were not playing at chivalry. They were preparing for real combat in which real men died slowly from gut wounds, or quickly from a blade across the throat, or eventually from infections that turned a minor cut into a death sentence. When you turn on your central heating on a cold winter morning, when you open your refrigerator and choose from a dozen options for breakfast, when you step into a hot shower and let clean water run over your body, when you lock your front door and feel the simple, profound safety of a world where no army is likely to appear on the horizon, remember that for centuries, the people who lived inside these stone fortresses had none of these things. They had thick walls and sharp swords. They had each other. They had routines and rituals and a faith that gave structure and meaning to their suffering. And they endured. Generation after generation, they woke in the cold, climbed the worn stone steps, looked out over the same fields and forests, and lived their lives within the narrow, demanding boundaries that the castle defined for them. This was not a fairy tale. It was not a horror story. It was simply life, ordinary human life, lived inside extraordinary walls, with all its contradictions, its cruelty, its grinding monotony, its unexpected moments of warmth and beauty, and its stubborn, enduring, deeply human refusal to be broken by the hardness of the world.